Okay, so welcome to this afternoon's workshop, which is about writing pantoums, and in particular writing pantoums in the context of poetic inquiry. As you can hear, I'm nervous getting into this and getting used to the getting used to the tech, but I'm really hoping I get past it, because this is a poetic form I really enjoy, and my hope is that we'll have yes, a good engagement with it over the time. What I was hoping that we would use the time for is I'll talk a little bit about how I've used pantoums. I'll mention the connection with the topic of protest as well. Why is it that I'm calling them pantoums of protest? But I'm really hoping that people have come ready to do some of your own writing as well. So my intention is that that I'll talk and do an introduction, and I'll show you how the pantoum structure works, just in case. I mean, I'm imagining in this group that most people are very familiar, but and then I'll move into I'll host a couple of writing moments, sort of 5 minutes at a time, and then we'll pull things back together again. So that's my intention for the session. My guess is that we probably won't use the whole time, but that's also very difficult to judge, isn't it? So let's see how we go. Yeah, hopefully we'll get the time we need. Let's put it like that. So the slide that you can see at the moment was my original pitch for doing this workshop. I think if I had written that pitch a little bit more recently, it would probably look a little bit more like this. So hopefully the slide moved on. If you just give me a little wave to say that that you're now seeing a yellowish looking slide. And again, it's got lots of words on it, but the main thing that I wanted the image to convey, I suppose, was the overlay between the text and the who we are. I mean, it's been lovely actually being in various of the different sessions and seeing how other people are working with structured poetic forms. So I was in the presentation about the use of the ghazal. I saw this morning that Catherine Pithouse Morgan also talked about pantoums as well. And I think what I'd say about working with structured poetry in general, and maybe the pantoum in particular, is that I really love working with structured poetry about 80% of the time. And I love it because the structure has a certain logic to it, whatever structure, whether it's a haiku or a sonnet. The structure has a story that it's telling. It's going in a particular direction. It's got expectations to be fulfilled in order for a piece of writing to be experienced as that particular poetic form. And what I find anyway is that as my sort of conscious scholarly wanting to do the right thing brain engages with the structure, and I sort of pay attention to trying to write something that is well aligned to the structure, that sort of, I take my eye off the content. There's a sort of relaxation, if you like. The structure has my attention, and in trying to pull content out to fit the structure, sometimes the content that comes out is a surprise to me, and in a sense that's one of the things I think that structured poetry can really help us with is to surprise ourselves with what appears on the page. I mean, I think that also works with free verse as well. But I wonder with free verse whether we have to already have a certain level of confidence in the process and in our ability to engage with the process, because the free verse has no clear boundaries around it apart from the boundaries that I impose. With a structure like a pantoum or a ghazal or a sonnet, some of my energy is going into meeting the expectations of the structure. And then the other 20% of the time I find the structure stifling, and that's probably a good sign that I might need to break the structure to in order to be able to continue pursuing the truth, or could continue to be in conversation with whatever it is that's emerging. I wanted to say before we go any further, just to acknowledge, and I think this was said this morning as well, that the Pantoum originally was a Malay structure, the Pantoum, so that's its cultural origin. It was, I think it's been described as a folk form. In the Pantoum form, I believe it was mostly love poetry and generally rhyming. And I understand that it was nicked, I think that's a technical term, nicked by Europeans in the 19th century. I think Victor Hugo wrote a Pantoum and set some new expectations or new rules about how Pantoums work. Certainly the Pantoums that I write tend not to rhyme, and they tend to not be about love, or not be directly about love. Wondering where I was going to go from there. I think yeah, so to acknowledge that when I write a Western style Pantoum, I guess I can't do better than acknowledge that it has a different cultural heritage, and just be clear that I'm not trying to mimic that cultural heritage in the writing that I do, but that it existed, and that's where it came from. The other thing I guess I want to say for our time together, I know Kimberly Dark in her keynote earlier in the week, she talked about the kind of writing that doesn't get presented to other people. So she talked about she writes, I think she said something like that she has a whole pile of poems called Bad Poems About My Mother, which are not intended for anybody else's consumption, they're her own writing. And the way that I'm approaching using Pantoums here is very much intended actually to produce the kind of work that might end up in a pile called Not for Anybody Else's Consumption. So, you know, it may be that one of the poems that gets written in this way goes through all of those processes, goes through all of the editing, all of the whatever, and ends up in a literary journal, or ends up in a pamphlet, or you know, or just in a paper, or consumed in public. But this for me is using poetry as a way to find out, as a way to try to process my own stuff, if the data is my own, or to try to dwell with the data of whatever it is that's being researched. So in the exercise that I'll be moving us on to, the expectation is not that we're writing beautifully finished pieces, but that we are using the structure as a way to help us to try and look sideways at what's going on, you know, kind of for ourselves. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is an example. I'm not going to read it out. I've got a couple of Pantoums that I do want to read later. One of them is written by a real poet, so I feel confident about that one. And then one of them is definitely one of these super bad poems that shouldn't be consumed in public, but I'm happy to share it for the purpose of you're working with the structure. I've put this on the slide though as an illustration, I suppose. The Pantoum became the poetic form that I used most consistently during my own thesis, which my own doctoral thesis, which I finished a year and a half ago or so. And I think during that process, I probably wrote 200 Pantoums over and over and over again, and sort of gradually getting deeper into the material as I went. And this Pantoum was written towards the end of that process, and look, so in some ways it's a summary. The left-hand side summarizes my sort of rather idealized position that I started in my doctoral thesis was a poetic inquiry, and it was dealing with questions of how do I and the institutions that I work in or engage with, how do I make sense of being a member of a generation that is seeing climate change, climate breakdown emerging ever more quickly during our own lifetime, or the evidence of it coming our way. And when I start, and I used walking and freeform writing and poetry to try to engage with that overarching question, and to try to also start to unpick questions around my complicity in the damage being done to nature. What should I do with that? And on this, I guess on this screen, on the left-hand side, the sort of the text that's in light green, I kind of started, I suppose, with this sort of idealized, you know, pastoral view, which could be summarized as town bad, country good. So countryside assumed to be the same as nature, town assumed to be nothing more than industrialization. And as I walked and wrote and considered, I came to a much more mixed view, of a view that started to perceive cities as as not straightforwardly evil places, and also seeing nature as not straightforwardly the same as the countryside, and those things not straightforwardly good. They're starting to get to terms with the kind of complexity of living a human life for me, in an industrialized, highly developed city. I live in London, but starting to come to see it as a complex, chaotic human constellation, and also seeing nature in the city and seeing myself as a nature creature who lives in an urban environment. I would still describe this, I think, as a poem that is on the bad poem pile. So I would describe it more as a poem which is a piece of analysis or a piece of interpretation, and not so much finished as an attempt to express something. So useful, maybe useful for me as the researcher, sort of first and foremost. And I just draw your attention to the photograph that's in the middle there, which kind of strikes me as a particularly romanticized view of being on a beach, the rainbow and a, you know, flower. But I'm going to, if you just bear that image in mind as we go to the next slide. So I don't particularly want to dwell on this slide, but I think this slide's kind of an attempt to reassure myself that it is possible to get out of the drafting and bad poetry stage and into finished work. And you'll see at the front on the right hand side that that photograph image appears on the cover of this pamphlet. So what you've got here are some poetry pamphlets which I'm shortly going to be releasing, which are the sort of public face or the public poetic face of my doctoral work, and that pamphlet that has the gerbera on the front of it, that one in particular is very close to some of the work I was doing during my doctorate. It's longer than the other pamphlets, and the reason for that is because the feedback from the first round of editing was that the Pantoums that I put in there felt, each of the Pantoums, they felt like there were several poems trying to wrestle their way out of the single Pantoum, which was a very, very fair comment, and I think it's actually quite a good if we're looking for a kind of a practical way to tell ourselves whether a poem we're working on is finished or not. I think asking ourselves the question, could this be 2 poems? Could it be 3 poems? That's quite an interesting question. If the poem could be broken and would work perfectly well as 2 different poems, maybe it's not the finished version of the poem just yet. So for me, I found that a useful kick to take a breath and slow down and focus on the one thread that that the poem wanted to talk about, and then leave the other material for other poems. And so that was the process I went through, is breaking them apart. Also just mentioned that there's a description of my doctoral work and the relationship that Pantoums had to that doctoral work in an article that's just been published by Educational Action Research, and the reference for that article is on the screen there. So moving on to an actual Pantoum. And I'm going to, so over the next few slides, the verse will appear, and I'm going to read it aloud, and then I'll just pause and talk about what the structure does. I mean, in particular, what's already been said about Pantoums in some of the other presentations is that they have this slow gait, this plaited effect, and what I particularly love about that is that you meet a line first in one context, and then it shifts and it moves into another context. And in the way that colours and shapes can sometimes be perceived differently based on what they appear next to, that can also happen in the context of the poem. I realise, being on the verge of going into this reading, that I still haven't quite said why is it that I haven't said at all, why is it that I find Pantoums useful in context of protest. So let me just say something about that before we go on. And in particular, because this poem, as some of you may be familiar with it already, Pantoum for My Father by Jean Kwon Glass, who's an Asian American writer. It's very much a first person story. It's a published poem. My issue, so I am not short of things I wish to protest about, and there'll be a slide, that clearly the state of the world. That's not surprising at all, and there'll be a slide in a few slides time which will show you some of the things that are on my mind at the moment. But my particular challenge with voicing protest is that I'm by nature, when I'm triggered or traumatized, I dissociate. And so what I find when I try to interact with things that demand rage or grief, that my first intention, or the first port of call, if you like, the first place I go is I intellectualize and I distance and depersonalize. And I'm not saying here at all that when we protest, we are obliged to share our personal trauma stories. I'm not that. It may well be that that the act of sharing is an act of power that someone wishes to step into, but equally we shouldn't be consuming each other's stories in this sort of voyeuristic confessional way. In my view, it should be a choice about how much we say. So when I say making a protest personal, I'm not necessarily saying making, a way of making a protest confessional or voyeuristic, but I know that in my case I tend to slip away from the subject matter and get very distanced from it. And one of the things I love about the Pantoum, in particular this plaited structure where ideas end up butting up against each other, is that it's a way of not quite tricking myself into making it personal, but it's a way it's a way of challenging the distanced, intellectualized way that I feel safer coming to these topics. So I'm using poetry as a means of stepping closer to the subject matter and slowing down and maybe having the courage to pause and have a little look. And I know that others may be very skilled and very familiar at doing that, but that is what certainly this poetic structure does for me, and it may be that other poetic structures would work just as well, but I particularly love the slow, twisty nature of the Pantoum as a way to see things from various different perspectives. So I'll read the poem, I'll show it on the screen as I go, and then I'll quickly recap on the on the structure. So, Pantoum for My Father by Jean Kwon Glass. In his goodbye note, my father blamed his parents for his inability to love us. At his bump shop on 14 Mile Road, he lowered cars on a platform. I loved to watch their steel bodies, dented or cracked, disappear, the shaft where the platform had been. At his bump shop on 14 Mile Road, he lowered cars on a platform. Sometimes I'd stand too close to the edge and hover over the shaft where the platform had been. I imagined him pulling me back to safety. Sometimes I'd stand too close to the edge and hover over. I stood at precipices and dared gravity to take me. I imagined him pulling me back to safety. My father and I are not unalike. I stood at precipices and dared gravity to take me. I've met a version of myself who doesn't need anyone. My father and I are not unalike. In his goodbye note, my father blamed his parents for his inability to love us. And so just putting the pattern on down the side of the screen. So you can see that in the first verse, each line is a completely new line. So it appears, so the first verse has 4 lines that don't repeat. And then if you look at the next verses along, each verse contains, each verse with one exception, contains 2 lines that are repetitions and 2 lines that are new. and then the final verse, so the middle two verses that's true of, and the final verse, we would normally expect to see that all 4 of the lines in that verse are repetitions. And in fact, in this case, that's not true, because the poet has abandoned line C from the first verse. You can see that line C would have said, I love to watch their steel bodies, dented or cracked, disappear. And she hasn't made any attempt to to repeat that line. She has instead she's instead said what she wanted to say, to move the poem forward. So I've met a version of myself who doesn't need anyone. What the thing that particularly had me wanting to use this poem as an example, the thing that particularly caught my attention, was that I read this as being as having an interesting journey in it from the first verse to the last, and it may well be that there are other readings, but in the first verse, so the first verse obviously is nostalgic. It's remembering her childhood relationship with her father, and it comes in hard, comes in strong, with a goodbye note. It's a poem of abandonment, and a poem of blame, or a poem of excuse. So the father has gone somewhere, death or left, and he's blamed his parents. And that line appears again right at the end in the manner of a pantoum, in his goodbye note. My father blamed his parents. But because it's now next door to the line, my father and I are not unalike, when we get to my father blamed his parents, to me that immediately says, oh well, my father and I are not unalike. It hints at the poet's own relationship, perhaps with the people she loves, perhaps with her own parents. I start to read in that new juxtaposition that the poet's also struggling with being able to be present for the people that she loves, or the voice anyway in this poem. That, and maybe even a coming towards sympathy, perhaps, for the father's position, that at least some sense of fellow feeling, which I didn't see at all in the first verse, and I only see it now because of the way those two lines have twisted in together. What I would say about that that line that is completely different is that my first tendency is to be very sort of rule obedient. So and that includes rule obedient in relation to poetic structures. So I have a strong suspicion that if this was my poem, I would be trying to twist and turn the original line C so that I could somehow make it do both things. That I could somehow say I'd kept the line in, but also I was making it say something different. And I sort of just admire the fact that she simply ditched it and said something different. That, and I think this is one of those imponderables, isn't it, with craft, that I've argued, first of all, that the structure is useful because it makes us write in a way that we hadn't necessarily intended to write. The logic of that suggests that the structure should be followed. But there's a point where the brave poetic thing to do, or the thing, there comes a point, as I said earlier, where I said 8-20, but it could be a different proportion. That there comes a point where it's no longer useful to obey the structure, and it is useful to obey the instinct to do something different. I think there's no rule that can reliably tell us which of those things it is. I think it's one of those trial and error, keep practicing, have a go. But I find it very interesting that it's useful to follow the structure until it's useful to break the structure. Who's to say? So one more example of a pantoum, which I'm not really planning to read, but I'll put it onto the screen. So this was one that I found this morning, and so I just came across it on the internet. I think it's quite a beautiful poem, but what I really loved about it is that it's a pantoum that declines the invitation to be in simple sentences that stop at the end. So I'm just going to go back a slide for a moment. In the example I gave you, here pretty much every sentence every line is a full sentence, and the next line is another full sentence. Whereas in this poem here, that's resisted. And I've put the headline, do pantoums have to be end stopped? No, they don't. Does using run-on lines make it trickier? Yeah, it does. So for example, the second line, the wild rose is still. The first time it appears, it says the wild rose is still in bloom, and the in bloom is on the next line. Then we go to the second verse, and following the rules of the pantoum, that second line is now the first line of the second verse. So, but of course now it's no longer next to the line which said in bloom. So now it says the wild rose is still, comma, frozen in fresh snow. So it's a little pivot around the meaning of the word still, and it works beautifully. But it's also taken, I suspect, some work to make sure that as the order breaks and remakes, that works. And so if you look down to the fourth verse, the line in bloom reappears, and they've made this work because the previous line was also not a complete sentence in itself. So it's got something to connect to. One last rose remains in bloom. So well done to that poet. It's a beautiful example. But this is probably, I would say this is pantoum writing, which is intended for performance and publication. This is polished, in my view. I just wanted to show it because I wanted to show you that it's the art of the possible, I suppose. So my hope for the rest of the session is that we start to do some writing, and I'd feel much more comfortable with this if we were in a room together and I could make eye contact and see that you guys are up for this. So I'm just going to assume that that anyone who's still here is happy to do some writing, and I'll take us through, and then we'll see what we create at the end. So I've got a writing exercise in 4 stages. So I'll invite you to do a little bit of writing, and then we'll pause, and then I'll invite you to do a few more minutes at a time. So to start with, so what I'd like, this is the thing that I'd like you to do first. So roughly 5 minutes. Write down, and this is coming back to the theme of the workshop, so that we're writing pantoums of protest and we're trying to make them personal. So as a starting point, I'd like to invite you in the privacy of your own notepad to start to free write all of the words that capture the issues that you feel strongly about, your favorite slogans or the ones you love to hate, the causes that are important to you, the issues you that you maybe find triggering. Just write yourself a list of slogans and topics that are protesty, that are relevant to you, and we'll take about 5 minutes for that. So that's about halfway through the time. If you're slowing down, you can always glance back over the ones you wrote at the beginning and see if any more spring to mind. And this doesn't have to be the definitive list. It's just what's on your mind today. One more minute. Okay, that's about 5 minutes. So let's pause on there. So I'm going to show you a slide which gives a cut of the words that came to mind for me when I did a version of this exercise. So these are my words. On a different day, I mean, some of those are pretty core for me, and some of them are things I'm pro, and some of them are things I'm anti or worried about or upset about. And probably the order that they came in would have been different on a different day. And what I'd like to invite for the next part of the exercise, and this is not for the whole rest of our lives, but it's just for the next 15-20 minutes or so, I would like to invite that the words that you have generated, your list of things that are alive for you as you protest, that I'd like us to do an experiment that says, well, maybe these words have become very familiar ways of expressing the things I have angst about or that I feel very strongly about. And so for the rest of the exercise, we're going to gently try and put those words into an exclusion zone if they're particularly precious and the only right word, and that you absolutely have to use them, of course do. But generally speaking, let's try to put them on one side and use other language for the rest of the session. And so what I'd like us to do now is to generate some fresh material that could be the starter for a little pantoum. And I'll bring up this first slide as an example. What I was trying to do in designing this was, so first of all, I was trying to get away from the language I naturally just fall into to describe the things that I feel strongly pro or anti. And as I said before, I personally disassociate and get distanced from the things that are important or the things that are going on. That's my mechanism. So I wanted to write a pantoum that was very much from the perspective of I. And so I'm going to invite us to write a series of 4 sets of statements that all begin I something. I'll give them about 5 minutes each. Ideally, it'd be great if you could come up with at least 2 for each one. And they don't actually have to stay within the formula, because sometimes the most interesting things we write want to stray away from the formula. That's fine. What I would say too is I know that some of the things we might wish are suitable for public consumption, or we would feel comfortable talking about them, and some of them may not be. So maybe what you might want to do is write first, let's say first write a series of I wish statements that nobody will ever hear, and you're going to burn the piece of paper later, and then a set that you would be comfortable talking about, and just ask you to take care of yourself as to which category things fall into. So a few minutes, probably not as much as 5, because you've already had that one up on the board for a little while. I wish statements. What do you wish? Okay, so we'll have just one more minute on that. Feel free to follow your hopes away from the formula, but try to have 1 or 2 sentences you'd be happy to work with in creating a little pantoum later. Okay, we've got 3 more of these stems. The intention is to have enough to populate a verse for Pantoum. So here's the next one. So I've used the word loathe. I kind of preferred it to hate, but you could dial it up or down. So you could also write, I feel mildly irritated by, or it pisses me off when, whatever language you're prepared to use. And let's have about 5 minutes. Again, you can stray away from the stem, but try to have at least 1 or 2 that you'd be happy to work with in the context of a pantoum. Okay, one last minute for that. Remember, if possible, you're staying away from your usual preferred protest words. But obviously, if you have to use them to express your loathing, you have to. Okay. Third set starts with the stem I value. And again, if possible, not using any of your usual protest language, protest slogans. And again, 5 minutes. Okay, last minute. Hopefully you've got a fabulous list of things you value. Feel free to wander away from the formula if that's where your mind is taking you. Try to have one or two that you'll be happy to work with later. Okay, moving on. The final of the four. The phrase is I resist. Or you may prefer, when I first wrote this, even though in my structure, my fourth I statement was I resist, I found my fingers wanting to write I reject. So if you prefer I reject, feel free to work with I reject. We'll take 5 minutes. Okay, last minute. Okay, let's bring your writing to a close, or maybe you finished a while ago and you've been staring at the photographs. These are little Instagram collages that have been created from walks I've done in my local area. So, yeah. So I want to mention again that the purpose of this writing is, certainly the way that I've used it in my own practice, has been to try to come into conversation with the part of myself that is not immediately on the surface. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is not intended to be I don't imagine that this is like a plug and play Pantoum masterpiece. This has been a way for me to create some content, put it into the structure, let the structure move it around so that that the lines get new neighbors and get to be in interaction with phrases that they weren't necessarily interacting with in the first place. And really, for me, the process is interesting or successful if there's one or two places in the word soup that follows, the little Pantoum collage that we're creating, that provoke our interest. So if I was trying to write something which eventually would be a poem in a paper or in a publication, this would be very, very much kind of raw material, looking for the places that are alive or tender, or that I wasn't expecting to see. So what you see on the screen here is I have followed the Pantoum structure, and I've put these little stem sentences in order. So first verse starts I wish, I loathe, I value, I resist, which is what we've just gone through, and then filled in the rest of the template for a 4-verse Pantoum, continuing to use that order. So when we get to the next new line, which is line E, it goes back to I wish. F is I loathe, so it's following the same format again. And it's really a, what are we going to be surprised by? The original inspiration for this was one way of using a structure that looks like this would be to play an Exquisite Corpse type game, the Surrealist, where different people contribute different lines to make up the I loathe, I wish, I resist, and we end up with a real mismatch or a real hodgepodge at the end, or maybe it would be surprisingly similar. But in this context, I'm going to suggest that we continue for now to work individually, and then we have a little bit of time where we can share things if we want to at the end. So we're at 1/4 to the hour, and we're scheduled to be together until 20 past the hour. Again, I don't think we'll need all of that time, but I'm conscious that the closing ceremony will happen on this Zoom, so we'll clear out, well in advance of that. What I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm going to give you an example, which was what I generated when I went through this process, which I cannot stress strongly enough that this is not a piece of work that I would release into the world as a polished, finished poem. And it certainly had a few surprises in there for me. And then what I'm going to, then I'll put this, so I'll put that on the screen and read it to you, trying not to be too embarrassed. And then I'm going to put this grid back. And what I will invite you to do at that point, so you can be starting to think about it if you want to, is that you pick a couple of your stem lines and you get ready to just populate the grid and see what you've come up with as a Pantoum. So this one was mine. Maybe I'll just read it and then tell you what was on my mind. And of course, bearing in mind that I was trying to obey the rule, which was not to use slogans or established jargon. So, I loathe or I reject the patriarchy, for example. No. And so I came up with this instead. Please don't take it as my finished final word on the subject, but here goes. I wish I'd slept around more when I was beautiful. I loathe the idea that I should still look like 30 aged 50. I value the slow unwinding of a day with no deadlines. I reject the self-promotion that takes full credits for achievements. I loathe the idea that I should still look like 30 aged 50. I wish my caregiver hadn't undermined me as a child. I reject the self-promotion that takes full credit for achievements. I loathe dingy sports bars where the floors smell of beer and ash. I wish my caregiver hadn't undermined me as a child. I value blue tits jumping between branches on the silver birch. I loathe dingy sports bars where the floors smell of beer and ash. I reject the self-erasure that agrees that I'm worth less. I value blue tits jumping between branches on the silver birch. I value the slow unwinding of a day with no deadlines. I reject the self-erasure that agrees I am worth less. I wish I'd slept around more when I was beautiful. What I will say about this is that, so one of the things that's been on my mind a lot as I approach 50 is the expectation on women to look a certain way or not look a certain way. So that's pretty straightforward in me. I loathe the idea that I should still look like 30 aged 50. And obviously, in some ways, my choices about how I look are constrained. They might be constrained by how my body is unraveling, or they might be constrained by the weight and shape of my body, which may or may not be something within my control. But there are things like makeup, fillers and surgery and hair color, which are within my control, and where I've taken, at the moment, who knows how it'll be in the future, but at the moment I've taken a view that I wish to look my age, whatever that means. I wish to let my hair be grey. I wish to not have plastic surgery, wear not very much makeup. And what this poem surprised me with was, I mean, I kind of know that I wish all of that, and I feel aggrieved that I'm supposed to try and carry on looking 30 or less than 30. but I hadn't understood that at the same time I was also partly buying into that idea that I was somehow now in the wrong because I'd let my beauty slip away, whatever beauty I had. And I find what I find really fascinating in what I consider to be a very unbaked poem is with the intersection. Let's say the last two lines: I reject the self-erasure that agrees I'm worth less. But there's part of me that sort of buys into it too, because I wish I'd slept around more when I was beautiful. So this is it's a bit of a fever dream, but there are things in here that I wouldn't have set out to admit or set out to say, but they found themselves on the page. And I'll just show you the next slide briefly, because while I was preparing this, I came across an image on Twitter, which to me felt like it was also capturing some of this sense of unease. So it's a photograph of t-shirts being sold somewhere in the States with terrible gender messaging on them, just awful, terrible gender messaging. And the person who has posted it, that's their point. The two genders, sex pest and body dysmorphia, but this sense of unease about the standards we're held to, standards we're resisting, the way that my subconscious might still be buying into the standards that I claim to be resisting, and so on. So I'm just going to take it back to the outline, and I'm going to give you 5 last minutes to pick a couple of your stem sentences and put them in the pattern. And if anybody wants, presumably after this session, very happy to send you a soft copy so you can play around with them to your heart's content, or indeed a copy of the presentation. But certainly, and it's pain in the neck when someone gives you an editable piece of software, but in a form that isn't, clearly you can't edit this. Okay, last minute. Hopefully something interesting is starting to emerge. Okay, bring that maybe to a close. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And just open it to, in case anybody would like to share anything or say anything or ask anything. This is the unstructured part of the time. Thank you, Mana. What I would usually do, or what I would hope to do, in either in person or in a Zoom format that was with individuals rather than rooms having joined, would be to put people into small groups where you could either share a little piece of your writing or throw different lines in together, so that between you create a pantoum. And as I was saying before, this isn't really intended to create anything in the first instance that is either that either makes sense or is any kind of work of genius. But what I experience when I work with the pantoum, and when I work with this sort of trusting free form type writing, is that I encounter things that surprise me, and they then can become a starting point for the next round of work. So, I mean, I think if nobody has anything that they want to say or share at this point, we might just close the workshop a little bit early, because I'm kind of at the end of my my material here. I mean, I could speak poetry at you for the next 10 minutes, but I'm not sure it's necessary.